The first process that Chew Easy Peanut Butter is going to have to utilize to turn raw peanuts into finished jars of peanut butter is to properly prepare those peanuts to be made into peanut butter jars. Like, you can't just throw a whole peanut, shell and all, into a grinder and whatever comes out put into a jar. No one will want that peanut butter. You need to go through and you need to shell, roast, salt, etc. those peanuts so that they're ready to be shipped off into another department where they're going to convert those now prepared peanuts into finished peanut butter. So the first department, the first phase in Chew Easy's peanut butter production process is the peanut preparation department. What costs would they incur within this department to convert raw unfinished peanuts into peanuts suitable to be made into peanut butter? Well, for direct materials, we would have the purchase cost of the peanuts. We have to have the peanuts if we're going to prepare those peanuts to be made into peanut butter. Maybe some salt gets thrown in during the process of roasting to give it a nice flavor before it's turned into peanut butter. There could be other things as well. What about direct labor? Well, it's still a very mechanized process of shelling peanuts and roasting peanuts, but people have to run those machines, which means the workers who are running those machines that are turning raw peanuts into prepared peanuts, their labor costs are direct costs, and therefore the direct labor costs would be our workers' salaries. And then manufacturing overhead, everything that's very hard to trace to any one particular batch, would be things like maintenance and depreciation on the machines. Maybe we have some indirect labor, maybe we have some indirect materials. Who knows? But we have all these manufacturing overhead costs, which we can track within the peanut preparation department. And because we are using process costing, we need to track all of these costs that are being incurred within the first phase of production, so we can later transfer these costs on to subsequent phases of production that occur farther down the line once we have these peanuts properly prepared for them. And to do so, we're going to record those costs on a document called a production cost report, which everybody calls a PCR for short. We're going to complete one of these for each department, each phase of our production process, each and every period. They're going to keep track of two things. Firstly, the physical flow, which is the number of units. And in our case, it's how many cases of peanut butter, or how many cases of peanuts to make peanut butter, came through our department, came in, how much got transferred out, etc. So it's actually the physical number of units, and with those units comes cost. So we're going to have a separate section which tracks in dollar amounts the cost that was incurred in the peanut preparation department: materials costs, labor costs, overhead costs, etc. When finished, here is your finished product. This is what the PCR for Chew Easy Peanut Butter Company's peanut preparation department is going to look like for the month ended July 31st, 2018. And it has two different sections: the unit section, the physical flow section. The section calculates, how many units in total were in the department during the period, from what we started with, plus how much new production we started during the period. That tells us how much we have to account for, how many cases worth of peanuts were in this department in total during the entire period. And then of those units that we know we have to account for, what portion of that was transferred out for further production in departments later down the chain, and what portion of those units to account for are still being worked on within the peanut preparation department at the end of the period. So that's the purpose of the physical unit section, is to make sure that you've accounted for all of the actual quantity of goods that came through this department during the period. We're going to have to convert those to a thing called equivalent units, which I'll get to on a slide coming up pretty soon here. But once we have all of that, we can figure out the cost section, which is basically how much cost did we spend in total, how much cost do we have to account for materials and for conversion costs. And conversion costs means labor plus manufacturing overhead, the stuff that you need, the two vital components to turn raw materials into a finished product. I have seen these things done before where they have separate columns for labor and overhead. I've chosen for you guys to bunch them into one column to make this briefer and shorter. You're still going to come up with the same number in the end. And once you know how much material cost and how much conversion cost that you have for that particular department, you know how much total cost you have to account for. And by account for, just like we did above with physical units, we got to figure out what portion of that cost should be transferred to a subsequent department, the next phase of production, and what portion of that cost is committed to units which we are in the process of still preparing at the period's end. Therefore, the WIP of the peanut preparation department. And you should account dollar for dollar. This is a big document and it needs to be done step by step. So I'm going to do it step by step. In order to keep it so everything's visible on the screen at once, I've split it into two parts. So I have like one slide that is just the unit section and one slide that is the cost section. On the real document, it's one big tall document. I broke it into two for the purpose of this presentation because it makes the numbers easier to see instead of having a bunch of very small numbers bouncing in and out of the chart and having numbers go everywhere. What information you're going to need in order to do this is information for both your units, your physical flow, and your costs related to what was in your beginning WIP. What amount of peanuts, what amount of cases worth of peanuts did we have in production when the period started, and what amount of material costs and conversion costs have we already committed to units which were in the process of making when July started. We need to know how many units we started in production during the period, and then what costs we added for those units that we started in production for both materials and labor. We have all that information. And then lastly, we need to know how many units were transferred out. So how many cases worth of peanuts did we transfer from the peanut preparation department to the next phase of production? And then how complete the units which we didn't finish are when the period ended. So for Chew Easy over here, they didn't finish, as we'll get to, all of their cases worth of peanuts when the period ended. Like when July ends, we still have some peanuts going through the chain that maybe they aren't shelled, maybe they're not properly roasted, maybe they're not seasoned the way that we want them to. Like we're still working on them when the period ends. But those units are completely done for direct materials, but they're only a quarter done for conversion costs. So we still got some actual labor and overhead to incur to finish processing those peanuts. And now that we have all that information, we can start filling out our PCR for the peanut preparation department. You always start with the physical units section, and that is to figure out, okay, we had X amount of units come through our department during the period. We had X amount, in our case, of cases worth of peanuts come through the peanut preparation department. What amount of those were transferred off for further production, and what amount of those cases of peanuts are still here in the peanut preparation department when the period ended? Well, to figure out where they are, you need to figure out how many units you have to account for. And if you take the number of physical units that you had in beginning WIP, which our information tells us up here is 8,000, and add to it how many new cases we started production of during the period, when production started was 42,000, you figure out how many cases worth of peanuts. You got to figure out where they are. We have 50,000 cases worth of peanuts that were in the peanut preparation department during the period. We got to figure out how many of those cases got transferred for further production and how many of those cases are still here within the peanut preparation department. Well, we have part of that information. We know that we transferred out 40,000 cases worth of peanuts during the month of July to be made into peanut butter. And if we got 50,000 that were in the department during the period and we only transferred out 40,000, that means that we must be working still on 10,000 cases worth of peanuts in the peanut preparation department when the month of July ends. But if we know we transferred out 40,000 cases worth of peanuts and we know we're still working on 10,000 when the period ends, that means we've accounted for all 50,000 cases worth of peanuts. Those two numbers have to be the same. Like if you have units that you need to account for that you've not accounted for, you're missing information. You got to go back through, check all of your records, requisitions and purchase orders, etc. to figure out like what's going on here. You got to make sure that you know you are accounting for the actual amount that you need to account for. Next to this, after you've got your physical units down, you need to convert those units into what they call equivalent units. And equivalent units measures the cost of partially completed units in terms of completed units. That's a fancy phrase right there, but it can be much more succinctly stated as saying we completed a certain amount of units, a certain percentage of the way. How many units could we have fully completed for that same amount of cost? If you, breaking it down to very small numbers, if you had 10 units that are half done, that is the same amount of cost that it took you to finish 10 units half of the way as it would have cost you to finish 5 units the entire way. So we're converting partial production into the amount of units we could have completed all the way through for that same exact cost. And we're going to do this separately for our direct materials and our 2 conversion cost components, our direct labor and our manufacturing overhead over here in the equivalent units section. So let's start with direct materials. We completed and transferred out 40,000 cases worth of peanuts during the period. Of those 40,000 cases worth of peanuts which were transferred out of production, how many of them were complete for all the direct material costs, the peanuts, salt, etc., that we put in the peanut preparation department? And the answer to that is 40,000. And the reason why is you would never transfer out units from the departments to the next phase of production if they weren't done. Like, we would never transfer peanuts to be made into peanut butter if they weren't shelled, roasted, and salted. It's not how our production process works. So for completed and transferred out, the equivalent units has to be equal to the actual physical units that you had. It doesn't make any sense that we would transfer out units which are only partially complete for the stuff that we do within our department. As for ending WIP, that might not be all the way done. We're still working on it, so it might not be completed the entire way. What you need to do for this section here is take the number of physical units that you have in ending WIP and multiply it by how complete they are for that particular cost component. So our 10,000 cases worth of peanuts, which are in our ending WIP in the peanut preparation department, are 100% done for direct materials. And because they're 100% done, our equivalent units is exactly the same as our physical units. Like, to complete 10,000 units all the way for the cost of peanuts and the cost of salt, etc., it has to cost us the same as it would cost us to complete 10,000 units all the way. Because we have 100% completion here, our equivalent units for direct materials and ending WIP is exactly the same as our physical units. But the same is not going to be true over here for our ending WIP for conversion costs, because our conversion costs are only 25% done. Like, those units are only 25% done for labor and manufacturing overhead at the end of the period. So what we need to do in equivalent units is figure out how many units we could have completed the whole way, properly making that many cases worth of prepared peanuts to be transferred off to be made into peanut butter for the same cost that it took us to complete 10,000 units a quarter of the way. And to figure that out, you just take your physical units and you multiply it by the percent of completion. To finish to all the way, actually, let me take that, I'll take that back. To complete 10,000 units a quarter of the way, 25% of the way, cost Chew Easy Peanut Butter Company the same amount of money as it would have cost them to complete 2,500 units the whole way through. So for equivalent units for conversion costs, we're going to come up with a total of 42,500. And what this means is all of the units that came through Chew Easy's peanut preparation department during this month of July cost them approximately the same amount for conversion costs as it would have cost to complete 42,500 units the whole entire way. And we're going to need this right here, our equivalent units of production, as they call it, to calculate out what our cost per unit is later. You can't, it's really hard to figure out, all right, how much do we spend in materials or labor costs per jar if some of those jars aren't done the whole entire way, because they'll have labor costs that are less than it actually costs to complete a jar the entire way. So now we made these numbers so we can figure out further calculations in the cost section. And in this cost section, we're going to figure out how much cost was incurred to make all products that came through our department during the period, and of that total amount of cost that was incurred, how much of that cost needs to be transferred to the next step in the production process, and how much of that cost is going to stay here in the peanut preparation department as our ending WIP. So let's start up here with direct materials. Our information tells us that the units which we were working on when July began already had $9,800 worth of material costs committed to them. Like, that was our ending WIP for the prior period for June, so it becomes our beginning WIP in July. And then, during the period, our purchase orders tell us that we spent an additional $130,200 on material costs to acquire peanuts, salt, etc., oils maybe, that we're going to need to properly prepare these peanuts, which means of all of the peanuts that came through our department during the period, there's $140,000 worth of material costs, some of these two numbers above, that we have to account for. Well, our total equivalent units of production for direct materials was 50,000. And I'll just hit escape here really fast and go back up to the prior slide so you see where that number came from. That number is this guy right down here. Our equivalent units of production for direct materials is 50,000. Our equivalent units of production for conversion costs is 42,500. So when you need that number, it comes from the total units accounted for in the physical unit section of your PCR. And here's the answer, but we'll go back in. So now, if it took us $140,000 worth of material costs to make 50,000 cases worth of peanuts, that means each case of peanuts that Chew Easy Peanut Butter Company made during the period had a material cost of roughly $2.80. For conversion costs, the units which we started the period with had $3,910 worth of costs committed to them. We added another $22,090 worth of labor, $42,000 worth of manufacturing overhead allocated, a total of $64,090 worth of conversion costs. So if we add those two numbers together, we have $68,000 worth of conversion costs that we have to account for. We got to figure out what portion of those $68,000 worth of conversion costs are being transferred to the next phase of production and what portion are going to stay here within our own department. Well, let's divide that by equivalent units of production. How many units in full we could have finished for that $68,000 worth of conversion costs. And our number from above was 42,500. So if we spent $68,000 worth of costs, and we know that's enough that we could have completed 42,500 units the whole entire way, our average cost is it takes about $1.60 in conversion costs and labor and overhead costs to complete a case worth of peanuts and make them properly prepared to be turned into peanut butter. So our beginning WIP in total had $13,710 worth of costs already recorded to it, which we carried into this month from the prior month. During this month, we added a total of $194,290 worth of costs that were unique to this peanut preparation department. If we add together either these two numbers, 140,000 plus 68,000 is 208,000, or these two numbers, 13,710 plus 194,290 is also 208,000. Doesn't matter if you go across the row or down the column, you should come up to the same number, and that is, in this case, 208,000. Peanut preparation department had $208,000 worth of costs tracked to units which were in this department during the period. And now it's our task to figure out what portion of that $208,000 we're going to transfer out and what portion of that $208,000 is going to stay here. Well, let's do that. Let's account for our costs. For completed and transferred out, what we're going to do is we're going to take the equivalent units of production which were transferred out. Recall above, we transferred out 40,000 units. They had to be done for all of their material costs, or we would not have transferred them out. We'll multiply that by our cost per equivalent unit of production, and right here it tells us that for materials it takes about $2.80 worth of materials to complete a case worth of prepared peanuts. So 40,000 cases at a rate of $2.80 per case is $112,000. In those 40,000 cases worth of peanuts that we transferred out of the peanut preparation department, we incurred in this department $112,000 worth of material costs to properly prepare those peanuts, and that $112,000 worth of material costs is now going to be transferred to our next phase of production. For the units that are still sitting here in ending WIP, we have 10,000. We have 10,000 units in our ending work in process inventory, which are entirely complete for direct materials. Our total EUP for that cost component was 10 grand. If we multiply that by the 280 cost per equivalent unit, we come up with 28,000, which means we have $140,000 worth of material costs that we need to account for right here, and we have that number. Next up, we have our equivalent units of production. And our equivalent units of production for conversion costs is also 40,000. If we're going to transfer 40,000 units to the next phase of production, they have to be complete for all the conversion costs necessary in the peanut preparation department. And our cost per equivalent unit of production for that for conversion costs within this department is $1.60. So those 40,000 cases which we transferred out cost us $1.60 in conversion costs a piece. It means that $64,000 worth of conversion costs should be transferred from the peanut preparation department to the next phase in the production process. We have 10,000 units left in our ending work in process, but our information told us a couple of slides ago that they're only 25% done. Those 10,000 units that are 25% done, therefore, cost us about the same as it would have cost us to complete 2,500 units the whole entire way. So we have 2,500 equivalent units of production in our ending WIP. And if it costs $1.60 to finish a case worth of peanuts for all of our conversion costs within our department, that means that the 2,500 equivalent units we have in our ending WIP at a rate of $1.60 a piece cost us $4,000. And if we add that up, we come up with $68,000. So now, when we add this all together, we're going to have a grand total of $176,000 worth of costs that we transferred out. So for the next phase of production, when they're doing their PCR, they're going to denote the $176,000 were transferred into them from us during the period. That's the amount of cost that left our department, which is now flowing farther up through the production chain. Our units that are left here that we're still working on already have $28,000 worth of material costs and $4,000 worth of conversion costs committed to them. That's going to be our ending WIP, which our department can therefore next period during August turn around and use as the beginning WIP for that period. We know now that of that $208,000 worth of costs that we have to figure out how much is getting transferred and how much is staying here, $176,000 is being transferred out. $32,000 is going to stay within this department, but that totals up to $208,000, which is also conveniently the $140,000 worth of material costs plus the $68,000 worth of conversion costs. And you'll know that your PCR is done correctly because those numbers, just like we did with physical units, they have to match. You have to know where every dollar that you determined you have to account for ended up and is therefore accounted for. You need to come up with the same number for your total cost to account for and your total costs which were accounted for when you determine what amount of cost is being transferred out and what amount of cost stays here. If you don't have a total amount that was moved around between different departments equal to the amount of cost that was incurred, you're missing costs that need to be contained somewhere. So you got to go back and find it. But in total, there is our finished product one more time. We have all of the information that the peanut preparation department needs for its PCR, information that can be passed further down the line as we continue to account for the manufacturing costs of Chew Easy turning raw peanuts into finished packaged peanut butter.